Well, hello everybody. Warm welcome to everybody to this session. My name is Andy Stirling. I'm a professor at the Science Policy Research Unit of the University of Sussex, and it's my enormous privilege to introduce this session on the Strings project, this side session on the Strings project. And we have a wonderful lineup of speakers over the course of this session, which I want to introduce in a moment. But just to set a little bit of context at the outset, the focus of the Strings project is rather ambitious on inclusive pathways for steering science, technology, and innovation in order to arrive best at the Sustainable Development Goals. And this challenge of aligning global research and innovation to this worldwide political agenda, in some ways there could hardly be a more momentous challenge than what this project tries to assist, the processes this project tries to assist. Because if we think about it at the outset, for several hundred years, progress, whatever that means to different people, has been whatever happened to come out of the machine. And as a result, what emerges relatively unquestioned, unscrutinized, under-scrutinized, are prioritized directions for science and technology in innovation in particular settings that are actually driven most strongly by the nearby interests of academic hierarchies, disciplinary agendas, private profit, commercial strategies, national interest, and military domination, to put it starkly, not by the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So what the SDGs then open up, really remarkably, arguably for the first time in history, is this negotiated space for deliberation at a global level about what the politics of different priorities and values and interests might be for science, technology, and innovation. And this is the challenge that the Strings project really tries to address for the UNDP, to produce outputs that can be workable and practical for that to that end, to be more rigorous and accountable about the directions taken by science, technology, and innovation. So that's just by way of setting the scene briefly. And what we're going to do now is spend 2 hours deliberating some of those challenges, some of the things that are coming up. The first session, we will hear from a range of speakers. And then the second session, we will have a panel discussion. Each time we'll have a little bit of discussion with a 10-minute break halfway in between. So may I then, just on the formalities, ask people the usual way with these Zooming we're all getting so horribly used to nowadays, to switch your microphone off if you are not speaking, and keep the video off if you wish, or keep it on. We're quite relaxed about that, and we should inform you formally we are recording the session, so I hope that is okay. When you put questions, when we come to the question session at the end of the first talks, please feel free to debate or raise any issues you like, but please do flag up issues you would specifically like raised for the speakers. And we have colleagues who will look at those and put them to us to be as efficient as possible with questions when we come to it. So those are the formalities. Let's crack on with the content. It's my great pleasure then to introduce our speakers. First, Pedro Conceição from the United Nations Development Programme, then Susan Cozzens from the Georgia Institute of Technology, then Tommaso Ciarli and Joe Chataway from the Strings project, all to address different aspects of this challenge of steering research and innovation for the global goals. So without further ado, Pedro, please.
Thank you, Andy. It's a great pleasure to be joined by all of you for what I'm sure is going to be a stimulating discussion on the role, or roles, I should say, of science, technology, and innovation in meeting aspirations of the 2030 Agenda. I would like to share some thoughts and reflections informed in part by the 2020 Human Development Report, which we launched late last year. And the report considers the question of how to advance human development as we confront the new realities of dangerous planetary change in a way that intersects with persisting and sometimes growing inequalities. Now, let me try to argue that the concept of human development has a lot to do with the SDGs. Human development sees people as the ultimate ends of development. So Andy was asking progress, whatever that means. From a human development approach, that is very clear. Human development shifts the focus from means such as income towards an understanding of development that's seen as a process of expanding freedoms of people to be and do what they value and have reason to value. Now, a central tenet of the approach is that people care and aspire to achievements in many dimensions. They do not necessarily pursue the maximization of only one thing, be it income, happiness, whatever you may choose. And I think that is why the SDGs are so well aligned with human development approach, because more than the specificity of any single goal, they reflect this idea that development is a multidimensional aspiration. Now, coming back to the 2020 Human Development Report, we know that prospects for advancing human development are conditioned by dangerous planetary change. And this is also clearly recognized in the SDGs, which include goals that relate to the challenges that would confront both when it comes to advancing human development as well as dealing with these planetary changes. In the 2020 Human Development Report, we looked at this notion or term Anthropocene, recognizing that it's a contested term for different reasons. But it reflects this notion that human activity is now driving unprecedented changes at the planetary scale. And we believe that it provides a useful frame that brings under the same fold different challenges that range from climate change to biodiversity loss. And in the context where also COVID-19 could be brought under this fold, since pressures on biodiversity have been linked to an increase in the frequency of zoonotic diseases. And COVID-19 may be just the latest of these. So it also brings an appreciation of how life and planetary processes are deeply intertwined. And we can look, therefore, at the 2020 Human Development Report as an invitation to look at challenges ranging from COVID-19 to climate, less as separate problems, but rather as manifestations of a moment where human pressures are driving dangerous change to us, as well as all forms of life on the planet. And so these challenges could be cautionary tales, COVID-19, climate, about the risks that we may confront going forward. Risks that I alluded to at the beginning are overlaid on a world with large and often growing inequalities. Inequalities that happen across countries, but also, as we emphasize in the 2020 Human Development Report, also within countries, with some groups being systematically more negatively affected than others. So we know that gender inequalities are being exacerbated because of COVID-19, that pollution still harms disproportionately racial and ethnic minorities, that human rights violations often overlap with the destruction of ecosystems. For instance, forced labor occurs in the very fishing fleets that are often destroying ocean ecosystems. All of these inequalities, in a way, reflect disparities in power and voice, which often perpetuate planetary pressure. So it's a very brief summary of the thinking and the framing of the 2020 Human Development Report. Now, given all of this, I think it's possible to articulate three roles for science, technology, and innovation in helping us to move towards the sustainable development goals. First, what I will call an instrumental role. So it's very clear that we must turn to science, technology to help us address concrete challenges. One recent illustration is the role that vaccines are playing in controlling the COVID-19 pandemic. And actually the UN Secretary General earlier this morning, as he addressed the forum, used this example also. We can also see how scientific and technological advances in renewable energies are making solar and energy economically more competitive. For a long time, even into the 21st century, alternatives to oil always seem to be economically out of reach. There was almost an economic law that said they would always cost 20% more than the prevailing price of oil, no matter what the price of oil was. But we now know that the price of solar has been dropping very rapidly. Since 2010, it has dropped by 85%. And today, wind and solar are actually the cheapest form of energy in many parts of the world. And by 2030, when we are meant to achieve the SDGs, they will likely undercut coal and perhaps other fossil fuels almost everywhere. So this is the first role for science and technology and innovation. As I said, an instrumental role, but we also know very well that what seems like a wonderful technological solution at any point in time may bring unintended consequences. This is actually the story behind the use of coal and oil, which powered today's industrial societies, but also created the climate crisis. Even if we look at the solutions that we're pursuing when it comes to renewables and hardware to power digital technologies, they are increasing the demand for a range of materials, which are currently being met primarily through mining and extraction. We know that currently global recycling rates are very low, perhaps no more than 5 or 6%. Therefore, I think that science, technology, and innovation have a second role, the role of being an enabler in understanding this impact over time of new technologies and the interrelationships of economic, social, and natural systems. This is something that cannot be done in a one-off kind of way, but something that needs to be pursued continuously and perhaps also in an interdisciplinary way. Here, I think that some of the work that has been done by the International Science Council in mapping the interlinkages across the SDGs to support decision-making would be a good illustration of this second role, the enabling role that science can play. We'll be hearing from Elisa later today, and she may wish to speak about some of this work in the context of the International Science Council. But let me finish with a third role that science and technology and innovation can play, in addition to the instrumental and enabling role that I described. And I will call this role close to what I think can be a constitutive role. And what I mean by this is that sometimes we look at the SDGs simply as problems to be solved, and they certainly include many problems to be solved. But I think, especially if we take this framing of the Anthropocene, it's best described as Juliet Nate Thomas and Amartya Sen both said, as a predicament to be navigated rather than a problem to be solved simply. So the inequalities that I alluded to that are reflected also now in access to COVID-19 vaccines, the digital divides, some of which are growing, cannot be done without having this broader perspective on understanding the role of science, technology as it embedded also in our societies, especially as social norms and our values also change and evolve over time. So I think that advancing this constitutive role for science, technology, and innovation calls for a deeper dialogue, not only between the natural and the social sciences, but also with humanities and even with other ways of knowing, such as those adopted by indigenous peoples. So I'll conclude by saying that enhancing these three roles of science, technology, and innovation in advancing the SDGs also calls for different types of engagement between policymakers and the world of science, away from a linear model where policymakers are merely seen as end users of scientific and technological advances. a much more interactive and iterative approach where both learn continuously from one another. And that was indeed the premise that led UNDP and the Global Challenge Research Fund to collaborate in supporting the STRING projects, which will hopefully help us to move in that direction. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you so much, Pedro, for that extremely illuminating and helpful scene-setting talk, the instrumental, the constitutive and the enabling roles for our challenge. I really appreciate it. And thank you. May I also say thank you so much, not only for funding this project to you and your team in the Human Development Report Office at the UNDP, but also for the way you've engaged with the project. It's been enormously helpful and a privilege working with you. So now we turn for the next part. We'll go through each of the talks and then come to the discussion session at the end to Professor Susan Cozzens, a Professor Emeritus in the School of Public Policy at the Georgia Institute of Technology, to give us our keynote on the context for this challenge. Susan, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for including me in the project and also for including me in this session, which is going to be very interesting. At this time in history, it's really important to take on the big challenges at global scale, and that's what the Strings Project does. Those challenges have actually gotten deeper since we started in this work together, so let me take a few minutes to make that clear. The project was undertaken in a world where wealth and power were already sharply concentrating in a few hands through new applications of technological capabilities. And we were already experiencing deep inequalities on a global basis. Now, what we can actually literally see in our Zoom screens is that we are all sitting in comfortable places. I've got my books behind me. Many of you are in your offices. We're watching something that's happening in a different time zone through the internet. And that reality is very, very far away for most of the people in the world. So I challenge each of you to take a moment right now and picture somebody who is not watching today because they don't have those conditions. The picture in my mind is of homeless people in Seattle, which is right across the lake from me. And with one more click, actually, you may all be able to see those too. I'm also picturing people who are much further away in Barrio in Maputo, one more click, where the women are walking long distances to bring water back to the households. Or with another click, a favela in Rio in Brazil with people living in houses made out of materials that they found in a dump piled on each other up a mountainside. So please hold those people, hold on to those people as we talk more abstractly about the depth of global inequality, because it's here in our lives. But you know, I'm a policy wonk. So now let me throw some numbers at you. At the end of 2018, there were 26 people in the world who owned as much wealth as the poorest half of the human population. All right, so 26 people on one hand, 4 billion or so on the other. That also tells us about the depth of the inequality. So my headline here, however, says that there's a connection to technological capabilities. So let me make that connection for you. In 2020, 7 out of the 10 richest people in the world made their fortunes in the IT industry. Now, the IT industry is just an example at the center of a technological revolution that brings wealth to some people and wealth to some places and leaves others behind. We've been living in that revolution for several decades now, and the gaps are actually still widening. But this is not a new phenomenon. This pattern has actually characterized the world economy since the 16th century. Each time a technological revolution reorganizes wealth and power, then we need new institutions to reverse that pattern and let us all in to participate again, to leave no one behind in the UN terminology. And it's those new institutions that the Strengths Project is about. So since the project started, the pandemic has made all this worse, vividly demonstrating divergence in life outcomes. So let's do another click. And another beyond that, the vaccines that Pedro has already referred to made the scientists the heroes, right? They are just incredible in this story. They tackled this virus, they got to know the virus, they started right in on producing vaccines and did it faster than anyone thought they would. And even the regulatory bodies have shown us, at least in affluent countries, the importance of having the expertise to really consider what's safe and what isn't safe and for whom in this environment. So really good news story for science. But we know that it's going to take a long time for those vaccines to reach the people that we pictured earlier, and that national contexts make a huge difference. Now in Seattle, even the homeless are being vaccinated. The homeless shelters have asked for the Johnson & Johnson vaccine because it's a one dose, and you can't count on somebody homeless coming back to get their second dose. India at some points was not projected to be fully vaccinated until next year, until 2022. They speeded up the process because of their current crisis, but there's a lot of steps beyond science in this process. In the meantime, people are dying by the hundreds of thousands. And India is getting the current headlines, but it could be many, many places. Yeah, I'm just looking to see where the slides are going. The story could be in many places. We have a Brazilian on the line who may talk about that. Now, just a few days ago, the infection rates in India were actually lower than in the US. So why were people dying? You can fill in that blank for yourself. The key is that the health infrastructure couldn't handle them. That is not a short-term issue, needs long-term investment in what people actually need. And just as a reminder, India's GDP growth before the pandemic was among the fastest in the world. So they were a good news story. And India prides itself on its role in the IT industry, on Bangalore and being part of the world-changing technological revolution. But even Kerala, the icon of equality because of the descriptions in Sen's work, now has the highest level of inequality of any state in India following its entry into the Knowledge Society. So despite the fact that science is the hero in this story, public trust is actually sagging to lows that we never expected in the technological community. Even health professionals are turning down these vaccines because they don't trust them. So this is another example of ironic and threatening gaps in how people understand safety, security, and prosperity in their worlds. And on top of all that, as the SDGs make clear, ecological disaster is looming. Let's go to the next slide. Now, this is not my area, so I'm really commenting as kind of someone who reads the headlines out there. On the one hand, I hear the news about the big ocean changing events happening earlier than projected, the ice shelves collapsing, the glaciers melting. I'm checking out the elevation of Redmond, Washington, because we can't really, we don't have room to store a boat in our little apartment here. On the other hand, I don't see what's called the developed world having a plan to move fast enough to prevent the catastrophic events. We appear to be stuck. And one more click there, perhaps vacillating between poles, but we really don't have any time to vacillate. Given the ecological damage that's already there, the loss of species, even a sudden rescue with something like carbon capture and storage might not pull us out fast enough. And there's no consensus on that as far as I can tell from the outside. So the Strings Project is incredibly important as an effort to point the needle in a different direction. to avert catastrophe and start to recreate the world that we want with the technological regime that we have, we desperately need to rethink the relationship between our social, economic, and political institutions and the use of our human capacity to know. That's what Strings is helping us to do. Thank you so much, Pedro, for funding the project, and thank you, Strings leadership, for taking it on.
Thank you, Susan, for that very eloquent and grounded message, and to remind us about the really hard realities in play here. Really appreciate that. Well, there's all kinds of issues raised there that people will want to comment or question, but one final talk before we come to that, an outline of the Strings project itself, its emerging findings so far, such as have appeared from Dr. Tommaso Ciarli of UNU-MERIT and of the Science Policy Research Unit in University of Sussex, and Professor Joanna Chataway at University College London. Tommaso and Joe.
Thank you very much, Andy. Thanks to everybody, particularly thanks to Susan and Pedro for such amazing introduction. I'm not sure I'll be able to make justice to those incredible introduction, but I will try. I will do my best. And I have 10 minutes before passing it on to Joe to continue with the second part of the presentation. But I would like, first of all, to thank the UN STI Forum this year, organizers, for the opportunity to present these emerging results from Strings and to discuss these crucial topics. I think Susan and Pedro have made clear how crucial they are with the distinguished and experienced participants who are today here in this forum. This is a very broad project, Strings, involving several partners from UK, through UCL, STII, NESTA, but also from a range of countries: India, South Africa, Kenya, Argentina, and obviously, crucially, UNDP. I'm not going to make any justice to all the work that has been done by many colleagues in this project, but I hope to keep some understanding of the wide set of research tools and policies that can be supported in order to improve, hopefully, the alignment between science, technology, innovation, and the SDGs, particularly in low and middle-income countries. So let me go back to where we started from. We started this journey from a well-known observation, as has been raised already, that although science and technology solve and create quite a few problems, like those related to the SDGs, scientific advance is unevenly distributed with respect to society and its diverse demands. What we mean here is that not all problems are prioritized in the same way in science, technology, innovation, and solutions affect people in very different ways across the globe, positively and negatively. And while it is obvious that there are priorities, it is less obvious that the priorities in science, technology, innovation often do not match the problems of those who are most in need and less represented, as already has been eloquently mentioned by Susan and Pedro. And lots of these issues and lots of these people coincide with the SDG targets. This is not something new, has been persistent for quite a while in the past decades, and it is ongoing today. It is not driven by the private sector. It is an issue, very much an issue also with the publicly funded research. And as you can see in the graph here on the left side, I'm not going into any detail of this graph, but I'm happy to go back to it during questions. A macroscopic indicator of this inequality is in the well-known evidence that most of the academic research, particularly 94% of SDG-related research, is produced in the global north, where the SDG index also scores highest. Low-income countries account, if you look at the publication in the Web of Science, for 0.2% of the published research, according to our definition of SDG research. Although a much larger share of their research is related to the SDG, much higher than the research which is done in the global north. North-South collaboration, if one can say, right, their collaboration do not improve the picture very much. 89% of quarter publication are within high-income countries and upper middle-income countries. And This concentration, if you look at below countries, we find the same concentration among organizations. Moreover, we're talking about inequalities. SDG related to pressing inequalities, conflict, education come last. They attract much less research than all other SDGs. And they're also quite disconnected from the research which is ongoing in other SDGs. So we have a huge challenge here, which is extremely complex. Which we try to address with the Strings project. The STI prioritization is the outcome of a very complex process. I'm not going to details of the number of complexities which are involved in this process. I'm sure some of them will come up during the discussion. But what we try to do in the project is to point to some potential solutions, and how to do that. We try to better understand such complexity. We try to maintain the complexity, embrace the complexity, but try to understand it better from different point of views, simplifying it in order to find leverages. And we do that from different levels. At the macro level, we map and visualize science, technology, innovation across time and countries in relation to the SDGs in order to try to better understand who's doing it, where, in what disciplines and communities, what type of science, technology, innovations, try to understand what are the synergies in research across different SDGs, try to understand what might be the main characteristics of SDG-related research in relation to the rest of the research. At a meso level, we go in depth and try to understand and consult a quite broad amount of experts to identify different areas in which STI can produce positive or negative impacts on SDG outcomes across different actors, across different contexts, across different types of stakeholders. And then we go even more micro and try to describe STI practices in different regional contexts involving very different actors with very different understanding of the impact of STI on the SDGs. So very briefly on what we're trying to do, at the macro level, we take a bunch of documents and we try to situate these documents in research and science communities, and then we try to link those research and science communities to different SDGs. And then we have a number of data that we can use in order to characterize those research and technology innovation efforts. Then, with this mapping in mind, we move one level below, beyond academia and science, looking at how different expertise across different contexts may have different priorities. And we ask questions such as, do different stakeholders and communities prioritize different STIs to address the same SDG? What are the plural and diverse understanding of future STI problems in relation to the SDGs? And then we move one step further, and we try to understand how these STI choices are prioritized actually in different contexts, and how do they lead to the choice of different pathways. So we ask questions about how different actors and communities locally and globally prioritize different STI pathways to address the same SDG, and how these different pathways are made by different actors, are influenced by different actors. And we focus here on 3 different case studies. In Argentina, we look particularly focusing on science and open science in relation to Chagas disease. In Kenya, like Victoria, we mainly look at the impact of the use of resources on conflict and how this can be mediated by different STI pathways of monitoring and control or fish cages. And in India, we look at innovation in rice seeds and trying to understand different pathways to promote climate resilience rice seed varieties and different ways of doing that, again, involving different actors. And then we take these different mappings and different levels, and we try to analyze and illustrate and explain different misalignments. So at the macro level, we analyze countries' research priorities in relation to SDGs since the launch of the UN 2030 agenda, and whether this prioritization aligns or not with their greatest SDG challenges in relation to measurable SDG targets. Of course, this is the data that we have. Then in the meso level, we contrast the distribution of science technology area prioritized by diverse communities of practitioners across different contexts with the emerging areas which are established in scientific research and innovation communities, and differences there. And then we analyze diverse views across sectors on which pathways should be prioritized to achieve the same SDG-related goals, again, in specific context in the case studies, and how different actors shape and see the SDGs and the pathways to address these SDGs. And then we try also to analyze how these different pathways are influenced and prioritized by the current, again, established STI at the global level. So this is just a very quick example of how we look at those misalignments at the macro level. India has been mentioned, is on the news. So this on the left-hand side, we have the main issues that India has been addressing and measured by the SDG index between 2008 and 2017, which are mainly in relation to zero hunger, health, sorry, I want to do that, health and well-being, gender inequality, clean water and sanitation, industry innovation, sustainable cities, life below water, and life on land. And then we look at the specialization of Indian research, and we see that their specialization is mainly on clean water and sanitation and affordable clean energy, which is not particularly aligned with what might be their main priorities. We bring them up to all countries and try to understand this relation across all countries and SDGs. And we do find that across countries and SDGs, we find a relatively positive alignment in SDG 1, 2, 3, and 6. So hunger, poverty, health, and clean water sanitation, which is positive news. But on all other SDGs, we do not find an alignment, or we find a negative alignment, such as, for example, in the climate-related SDGs. So high-income countries polluting and doing much less research in relation to how much they pollute. And that's it. We have lots of different results that we would like to discuss, but I think I would like to leave the floor to Joe and discuss what we could do with these results in terms of policy.
Many thanks, Tommaso. I wanted to go back to the meso and micro levels of the study that Tommaso talked about. So to just say a little more about what we're hoping to get from the Delphi survey and the case studies parts of the Strings research project. These strands of the project have been designed really to help us think about the following questions. What's needed in addition to funding and outputs to achieve impact and outcomes? So we know that relationships between research and innovation and SDG outcomes and impact are profoundly non-linear. We need to learn a lot more about the complex relationships between those different entities, the research that's done, the innovation that occurs, and SDG outcomes. And I think there's different ways in which we can look at that. I was very struck by Susan's comments on learning about the different social, economic, political, and knowledge generating institutions. What can we learn from the research that's being done in the Delphi and the case studies about where those relationships have worked in terms of creating pathways which have positive impacts in terms of SDG outcomes and different constellations of institutions that offer and contribute positive outcomes, and also what doesn't work, of course. How can we think differently about the focus of areas of research? How can we think differently about the focus within areas of research? So what we know is that if we look at the different SDGs, there is a very different profile in terms of STI, which is related to those SDGs. So if we look at SDG 3, health and well-being, relatively speaking, there is that SDG is well served by research. There's an awful lot of research that relates to SDG 3 as we've defined it. But within that category, of course, there's a huge diversity of research being carried out in very different ways. So how can we think about the sort of the balance between those areas of research within the different categories aligned to SDGs? In SDG 3, it'll be the amount of resource will be dominated probably by biomedical and lab-based work, is that going to get us to positive outcomes in SDGs by itself, or do we need to create more balance between different types of health systems research, different social sciences and natural science configurations? Where should decisions get made, and where should research happen? As Tommaso said, there is the overwhelming amount of amount of research that's related to SDGs happens in high income and upper middle income countries. Can we really begin to think about alignment between STI and SDGs with that profile? We hope that the Delphi survey and the case studies will shed light on what the implications of that imbalance are. And then finally, where are the main data and evidence gaps? There is a huge amount of activity in this space of STI in relation to the SDGs. So there is a lot going on, but there is still quite a bit to do. And particularly, I think, in relation to our understanding of what works in terms of making the connections, the multiple and diverse connections between research and innovation and outcomes. We need to do much more, and we hope that the Delphi survey and the case studies will enable us to put a spotlight on data and evidence gaps as well as the macro mapping. Can we move on, Tommaso? So this is my penultimate slide, and I just wanted to pose a few policy related questions, maybe provocative, maybe for this audience not quite so provocative, but we'll see. The first one, a basic question: is enough resource going into SDG relevant research and innovation? The majority of money spent on research is not going to SDG relevant research. Do we need more money spent on SDG relevant research and innovation? And of course, that begs the question of how we're defining SDG relevant research and innovation, but I'll say a bit more about that in my last slide. But keeping Susan's imperatives in mind, this is much more than an academic question. This is immediately relevant to life prospects and, as Pedro said, to our ability to tackle climate change and other existential issues confronting us. How do research funders best navigate the boundaries between research and SDGs? Research funders operate on a set of institutional norms, usually, which are very different from the ways in which development agencies operate, and the kind of metrics that both different types of institutions use to judge failure and success are very different. Is there a case for navigating the boundaries differently between research and funding organizations and those institutions which have development in mind? Do we need some of those new institutional configurations that Susan spoke about? Do we need a more systematic approach to gathering evidence about the relationships between research funding, innovation and development? As I said, there's a huge amount of activity in this space, but it tends to happen in a very fragmented way at the moment. And is there a case for an institution, an organization with global reach to take this bull by the horns and to take the task of trying to cohere research, bring together research that's being done, make it accessible to those who need it, and to have that as a mission? No organization or institution currently has that as its mission. Finally, should we better integrate science for policy issues into science policy and funding decisions? And for science and policy, I really mean science advice and the hugely diverse array of brokering and networking activity that we know are fundamental to being able to translate global goals into national realities. At the moment, that kind of science for policy, science advice, brokering activity is dealt with very differently and thought of very differently institutionally to science policy and funding decisions. Do we need to bring them together? Do science policy and funding need to address the need for directly for science advice and brokering. Tommaso, on to the last slide.
Just 1 minute, Joe.
Yeah, great. So this really is a slide that outlines our ambition to make the data that we've collected and the assumptions that we've used in putting that data together to make that open and to make it a policy tool in and of itself, and a tool that policymakers and researchers can use both to challenge the way in which we've constructed the data to give findings and to challenge the assumptions that we've used. So we are beginning to do that. Let's see if this works. It doesn't take me through to the link, but we have begun to put that up on a website. It's not the Strings website currently, but it will be. We'll put that dashboard up on the Strings website, and people will be able to explore it and challenge the assumptions and definitions that we've used. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Joe and Tommaso, for a fantastic summary of what is a very complex, expansive, and multi-method project. So we have a lot of chances to discuss these issues that have been so well introduced by our speakers this morning, and thank you to everyone for being so succinct and keeping to time. We only have 5 minutes now for this first bout. I encourage people, please, to either put in that 5 minutes, just put a question, put a sentence or two in the chat box with question above it, so we can spot that easily, because with so many people, it's more difficult to spot hands. So please do that. I'm just going to ask, while we wait, because I see that we haven't got any immediately yet, has anything surprised Joe and Tommaso?
Surprised in terms of research findings so far, Andy, or in
exactly?
Terms of the,
yes, yes.
I mean, I knew there was a huge imbalance in terms of where research gets done and where decisions about research gets made, but the 94% is a very startling figure. And if we needed a further call to action, that's it for me.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. So a question from Sophia. Oh, I'm sorry, I can't, my eyes are so poor, I can't read the your surname, Sophia, but would you like to express that? Turn your microphone on and state that question, please.
Yes, sure. Hi, good to meet you all. I'm also a former UNDP person and used to be working with SDG integration in Ukraine. And one thing that I didn't quite understand, Joanna, I think you were addressing this. I was just not quite sure what the result of that was. Because my understanding is that if we need to do research on SDGs, we need to understand what kind of research is needed to achieve SDG outcomes. It's not necessarily the same thing as the research, for instance, as if we want to achieve outcomes on poverty, then the research needs to be conducted on poverty. It can be conducted on economic growth, or it can be conducted on equality, where the poverty would be the area where the outcomes would be. So is this systematically considered in this in this string project that you're referring to?
Thank you.
Yes, it is. I'm going to hand this over to Tommaso to answer, because I think your question relates really to the mapping work that he and other colleagues have been doing. Tommaso.
Sorry, starting to get absolutely. And if you allow me to just share a slide for a minute, we do definitely, if it also goes in Shimon, you can see it better. We do definitely investigate what are the connections between different SDGs in terms of research, so where there might be some synergies in doing research. And as you say, there are a lot of connections between the research done on different SDGs. However, in terms of poverty, for example, this is one of the SDGs in which research, together with quality education, gender equality, reduces inequalities, all those SDGs related to inequality and conflict I was mentioned before are quite isolated from the rest of the research. So when we look at communities doing research on poverty, on gender inequality, on quality of education, so on and so forth. These are communities which are sort of self-contained and not much related to other communities, for example, doing research on growth, as you were saying, or industry innovation, although they are so strongly connected to, and as we might expect, research done on SDG 3, good health and well-being. So there's much more to say. I'm not going to take lots of more time, but there are connections. But we do find that these connections are quite loose, and are quite loose, particularly for those SDGs which do address the inequalities, the poverties, and the conflict which we so much need to address.
Thank you, Tommaso. And we're kind of at time now, but there is one more question that's popped up in the chat box. Forgive me, Mban Kabu. I will read it very quickly and see what our speakers would like to say in response, and then we can take a break. In addressing the whole issue of growing inequalities, to what extent have you placed this in the context of just transition? To what extent does the just transition discussions influence the course of the project? So who would like to address that point? I mean, I'm recalling myself to be associated with the project as well. I could.
Well, I was just about to say, Andy, this might be one for you.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I nicely batted back, Joe. I think it would be fair to say that it's massively important as a backdrop to the project. Those discussions about the importance of sustainability transitions being just transitions is really driving the research in ways outlined both by Susan and Pedro in the beginning, because that imperative is so crucial. And in trying to produce these tools, for instance, that Joe just talked, not just analytical tools, but participatory tools to catalyze more debate. That is a way of trying to equalizing the debates as well. Although the tools themselves are very technical, the hope is to try to be catalytic. So to engender more equal discussions about how to steer research and innovation. So not focally there as a framework, but very much part of the background for what the project is trying to do. So I always do this, speak too much. I think now we should take a break. That was a wonderful session, a lot of things to think about. I invite all colleagues here to please carry on putting comments or questions in the chat. We're going to hear from a panel with all kinds of reflections from different angles first in the second session, and then we'll have another broader period for discussion. So we'll take a break of 8 minutes now until the half hour, whatever time zone we're in. It will be on the half hour that we start again promptly at the same address. And thank you everybody so far. I look forward to the next round. Well, hello everybody, welcome back. I trust we're all here. I'm only seeing a fraction of the folk gathered with us today on the screen, but I think we should kick off because we've got a lot to get through, and it's my pleasure again to introduce this second session, which will run now for an hour and until the next half hour. Past the hour, whatever time zone we're in. And we're going to discuss some of the different implications first with a panel, each speaking for 5 minutes, then for an extended period of discussion. So please still contribute as you hear the panel to the chat box. Remember to please make all kinds of comments to each other and to the audience in general. But if you wish to have a point really picked up by our monitors, please put question in front of it in capitals so that we can easily spot it for the discussion session when it comes up. And then we'll be bringing those to the fore for that discussion. And then we will close after that discussion with a final talk, which I will introduce as we get near to it. So for now then, our panel has 3 distinguished speakers, all with very expert views on different aspects of the challenges we're grappling with here. Dr. Glenda Kruss, Executive Head of the Center for Science, Technology and Innovation Indicators at the Human Sciences Resource Council in South Africa. Then Professor Elisa Rice, Vice President of the International Science Council and at the Federal University in Rio de Janeiro. And then thirdly, Dr. Falk Schmidt, the Scientific Head of the Coordination Office of the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Germany. So I'm really looking forward to what our panel have to say on different aspects of this issue. 5 minutes each, please, colleagues, to give time for the discussion. And first to Dr. Glenda Kruss then, where I understand, Glenda, you're going to be looking in especially at the crucial question of how to build capabilities to these ends. Glenda, please.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you, colleagues, and the Strings group. Thank you for inviting me to speak. So what I want to raise some questions is about the challenges that you focused on at the micro level and particularly at the institutional level. And the Strings project, you've shown us quite some important insights into what research we do and how knowledge production is aligned with the SDG challenges. But what I want to raise some questions is about how we do research. And Pedro started off talking about how important it is to have an interactive approach and learn from one another. And I want to argue from our experience in South Africa and in the global South perspective, where the inequality challenges are so stark, that if we want to align our research and our knowledge production more effectively with the SDGs, we need stronger participation at the local level by the people who will be the beneficiaries and use of the knowledge and the users of the technological solutions or any of the interventions. And this could be whether people are in households or communities in relation to water, energy, housing, health. Susan has set out the challenges very, very clearly. So what we've been doing work on is the question of how do knowledge producers in public universities or public research institutes build successful and valuable interactions with users in local settings around knowledge generation, exchange, and use. And in our settings, particularly, when you want to build those interactions between actors in innovation and STI, you're dealing with disparities in power and voice in terms of inequalities of race, language, culture, class, education levels between those who are formal knowledge producers and those in local settings who would be the beneficiaries and users of those knowledge. So we focused on trying to do research on understanding the dynamic interactive capabilities that both sets of actors need to build up in order to facilitate this kind of interaction. So how do we learn through interaction? By continually sensing changes in environment, adapting to the need for new competencies and strategies, and then coordinating that learning back into practice of organizations. So we've looked within universities how they create these dynamic interactive capabilities to be able to work with particularly informal actors at local level. For example, you might have engagement champ. We look at competencies and internal and external interface mechanisms. So you might need to have engagement champions. You might need to build external interface mechanisms like innovation, local innovation hubs, science shops, and you might develop internal competencies that change the very way you're working within your institutions. But what we have increasingly begun to recognize is we know that universities have developed these competencies to work with firms, with government, and they're starting to develop it in engagement practice. But what we've increasingly come to recognize is the importance of building these dynamic interactive capabilities within the actors at local level as well, whether it's in households, communities, farmers associations, or informal enterprise associations, and so on. So how are those kinds of dynamic interactive capabilities built there? For example, through, again, champions, through participatory research projects, through community advisory boards on a clinical trial process, and so on and so forth. So at the risk of extending my 5 minutes, just in conclusion, I think when we're talking about putting into practice how we align STI to the SDGs, we do need to put effort and attention onto how we foster the capabilities for participation at local level of local level actors in order to, and that's a very difficult but very vital dimension of putting it into practice. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Glenda. That is a very important challenge, and it does indeed resonate with the scene setting at the beginning very strongly. And I suspect we're going to come to members of the project, but also our other speakers from this morning to respond to all the panelists. So I invite some comments to be thought about that challenge. But I imagine it's going to involve partly learning from what the experience you've actually been drawing on in posing the question itself. You answered quite interestingly some of the strands of it. But thank you for that. So now we move on to Professor Elisa Rice, and I understand, Professor Rice, you're going to ask us especially about where and how to start in this challenge. Please, Elisa.
Okay, thank you very much, Andy. Well, as Pedro Conceição said, it's part of our mission in the International Science Council to be the global voice of science, and for that we mean three things. First, to promote or to contribute to the dialogue within and between science disciplines. And it's quite remarkable that we have together social science, natural science, and life science. We also think that we must contribute to strengthen the dialogue between science and the policy community, but also between science and citizens and the common citizen. And it seems to me that this thinking about not science for policy, but policy for science, the disparity of research resources and the structures between low and high income countries is widely recognized, but it's also relevant to have in mind something that we often forget, that even in low income societies, objective research issues are not prioritized because of the international science system attributes higher importance and prestige to science puzzles that are alien to the needs of poorer societies or groups. Research communities are usually oriented towards the international scientific system that attributes resources, values, and prestige to issues and puzzles that do not correspond to what are pressing problems in the global south, for example. Given the mismatch, not only do high-income societies ignore objective priorities of their poorer counterparts, but they even drain sometimes human resources from poorer countries. I would say that to smooth the transit between research and action, and thus to effectively promote SDGs, it's critical we need to insist on their essential intermingle. As the pandemic shows, humans are all in the same boat, but this boat is a huge transatlantic with sharp hierarchical floors. Even though air transmission affects the whole ship, the worse off are more vulnerable than the better off passengers, but everybody is vulnerable somehow. My conclusion is that to efficiently cross research with words and action, we must insist on setting research priorities globally and channel material as well as human resources accordingly. I know that this may sound too idealistic, but we all know that opportunities to move ahead are always present, even if they are very modest moves. Considering that the present sanitary, economic, and political conditions magnify the need for transnational opportunities, let us seize this chance to move ahead, ensuring research programs that target knowledge production at the same time to systemic needs and to the ethical goals of social justice. I think inequality is something that pervades everything. But I mean, as a researcher, my main focus on inequality has been on the perception of interconnection by those who are not poor for the better off. I have been studying elite perceptions of poverty and inequality for over 2 decades, and I've seen that it's much easier to change when the ones on charge, the leaders, perceive that it's impossible to avoid negative external negativities, effects of poverty and inequality. We see that now with the COVID. The pandemic has led governments to move very fast to improve, to take measures like emergency help to poor people, not because of goodwill. Well, this may play a part, but it's mainly because the awareness of interdependence, of the negative externalities of poverty, move people to accept redistribution, tax reforms. So it's time to seize these opportunities so as to contemplate at the same time objective needs as exposed in the SDGs, using science, but also taking into account ethical principles of justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elisa. And like Glenda reminding us that it's not enough to talk about challenges of imbalanced power and privilege, but one has to directly address them, actively address those. And also the point you made, I think resonating with Joe's point at the beginning, but challenging the project to draw out a bit more, how it's not just about alignments between SDGs, but about that very large amount of research that is really not oriented anywhere near the SDGs at all. So thank you for that. And our third speaker, and we're going to come back to for answers. Please tell us in the discussion if you're not satisfied with these when they come through. But our third speaker to challenge the project and raise other issues is Dr. Falk Schmidt. And Falk, I understand that the experience in Germany has been particularly interesting on these issues that you've been involved in actually developing platforms for doing this kind of thing. So it'd be very interesting to learn from your questions and experience relating to that. Thank you.
Yes, welcome everybody also from my side, and thanks for Andy and team to invite me to provide some of the insights we have gathered. I would like to not to introduce just the platform, but to use bits and pieces of it. I think that resonates, in my opinion, very well with the overall goal of the initiative of the project. And the important part is that this German platform on the SDGs, one could say, on sustainability, became in some 4 years ago a part of the official policy process to implement 2030 agenda. So the official process is up and running as a strategy since 20 years, but obviously it came to be, or to mind, to policymaker that science has something to offer. And of course, there has been policy advice all around from the beginning, but that this is systematically linked into a dialogue, bringing to bear existing body of literature, of research, of people, transporting these insights is new, and I would say not unique, but also not so common until today. Why was done? Because it is expected that science can deliver and can support the implementation of 2030 agenda, and so help policy that the SDGs become more and more also a steering device for policy. I would like to raise a few points with a national and global dimension, fleshing out that the SDGs are universal. And I think I'm convinced, and this is maybe a little bit a different light of the, what was it, 94% of research money spent in the so-called global north, that it is, I would say, first responsibility that a country like Germany takes its own responsibility very seriously. So that it really makes the SDGs and national priorities, and to stop a situation where our solutions become your problems again. So being really aware of the feedbacks of the rucksacks, as we also say in this country, as our footprints, and to turn what was introduced at the beginning by UNDP, let's say this kind of footprints into positive footprints, like subsidizing the renewables also by this country, that this became indeed a globally applicable source of energy by now. So having this national priority with background of the global context, it's very important. And what was raised by Sophia, for example, in a question a while ago, to have also the systemic view on the different interconnections across the various SDGs, to maybe cluster it, to have transformation pathways, and to help policy to implement, to come to the impact. So this is science into policy, and that's what we try to do. And I would say we do it with this platform at a new level. And on the other direction, so the two-way street, how do we use the SDGs also to steer and influence the research policy? I would say that's it's also done. We have a rather large-scale framework, funding framework for sustainability-related research. And it was a national effort in the last years, steered by the research ministry, to align this research agenda more and more according to the various SDGs, singular, but also as clusters. And I would say even more important, though, that this is not even, it's a rather big compartment, sustainability research, but the whole notion of SDGs really reaches out to the other departments, to the other communities, as we heard, that they are connected, because health-related research, the economy or bioeconomy, whatever, big infrastructure research, fundamental research has something to do and to contribute to the implementation of 2030 agenda. And also there, this kind of research policy, some initial steps have been taken in the changes between the platform, its members, with a focus on policy, but also increasingly on the research policy, what we try to do. Last point, if one is serious about achieving impact, then we also have to have new metrics to measure these kind of impacts, that everything should change according to the 2030 agenda. The science system should also change according to the 2030 agenda. So we have national indicators. So what are good indicators of the, let's say, a free, independent research system and research community, but also a community that contributes. So what are a good measure for impacts of our research at the national level, but also with this positive international global spillover effects. So that's what we are trying to facilitate. We are now 4 years old. We are increasingly visible also at some of the global fora. HLBF, the context of the Global Sustainable Development Report is of course very important for us. And again, I'm very pleased to provide some of these insights as a very short snapshot to this audience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Falk. Yes, it's a crucial challenge in an area like this, a huge arena, long-standing activities going back years, to make sure that one learns from other similar initiatives in parallel and before. And we're very keen, not only with the experience you've just helpfully summarized there, but all colleagues in this meeting, we want to hear from you about wheels that do not need to be reinvented, trap doors that don't need to be fallen through again. So thank you very much for those points, Falk, as well. So over to I'm going to turn over to the earlier speakers, Joe and Tommaso from the project, also Pedro and Susan. Anything you wish to say in relation to these challenges of power, of privilege, of creating capabilities, how to measure it, some of these challenges, please feel free to respond, and then we'll open it up to the wider audience. Anyone like to pick up anything from our earlier talks this morning? I mean, this last session. Oh, Susan, please.
Sure. I just want to thank Glenda for bringing in the importance of real communication and mutual respect for knowledge between the scientists and engineers who are producing all that literature and communities where the results are going to be felt in everyday life, because it somehow, a lot of people seem to assume that all people need to do is talk. And in fact, of course, the experience is that the differences both in language and in the gaps in power and privilege make that communication very difficult, and that scientists and engineers are not good listeners often. So I really appreciate that point, and the fact that South Africa has actually been working on it quite hard. Where politics shifts, those things can shift, but then those processes can also help to shift the politics. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other points anyone would like to pick up before we open up to wider discussion? Please remind colleagues, please feel free to put your own comments or questions into the chat box, and we'll pick them up from there. Tommaso.
Yeah, no, I have a very quick comment about, well, on the three speeches, I think, perhaps, and the three intervention, perhaps, which is one of the difficulties that we have, I think, in understanding some of these relations, including the creation of capabilities, including the dialogue with forms of knowledge which are not coded in science, including the relations that we know from the past in the potential impact that different science and technological development can have on societies, not only in the countries that develop them, but also in other countries. A common problem that I see behind those issues is the data that we can use and the measurability of some of these phenomena, including how do we understand better what is the knowledge which is produced, how do we understand better which are the capabilities which are available in a given country outside the science system, how do we understand better what are the needs related or not to the SDGs which are expressed by different communities. If we lack a lot of this data, unless we do a lot of exercises like the one that we're doing and many others are trying to do, to go and talk to people, but obviously, I mean, we have limited time. So how do we get this voice and which data can we get in order to make a better representation of this knowledge and needs we should not capture in standard data?
Yes. Thank you very much. And I don't know if there's any other responses coming back, but something also occurs to me in terms of this crucial challenge around how to interact, how to engage with debates that actually are deliberately aimed at overcoming these massive gradients of privilege and reaching people who are most acutely vulnerable and have most higher stakes in these debates. One of the things I think we're trying to do, and Jo touched on it at the end of her talk with the tools and make it interactive, is not just to undertake these processes ourselves inside the project, which we have a number of different ideas and strands of activity, but to catalyze, to try and provoke and catalyze the very act of raising these issues, highlighting the mismatch between activity on research and innovation and the SDGs in general, as well as within the SDGs. The hope is this can help provoke all kinds of other self-organizing ways of challenging research and innovation systems around the world. But we're keen to hear more about that kind of idea as well as others. Jo, please.
Yeah, Andy, I just wanted to come back to the point that Falk made about the need for a new matrix for measuring impact, which I do think is vital, and you know, I think connects to the need for us to look for institutional routes to addressing the problem of alignment and misalignment. That seems fundamental to me. I take on board Tommaso's point that, you know, it's very difficult in some cases to come up with quantitative measures. Very difficult, particularly if you're thinking about Pedro's 3 ways in which we can think about how STI contributes: the instrumental, the enabling, and the constitutive, which I think is also really important for us to keep in mind. That it's not just a, you know, it's yeah, the ways in which STI relate to SDG is complex. We need to think much more carefully about how we judge the impact that we're having, the impact that we're avoiding.
Thank you very much. And that message from Falk as well, is that make sure one's own solutions don't become part of other people's problems. And that applies as much to us as the phenomena we're looking at, I think. So I don't know if any colleagues have, see any questions coming up. I don't see any explicitly flagged that way.
There are a couple of questions, and if you want me to.
Yes, please, please. And then I see Falk as well, but please, Tommaso, go for it.
Which, so I just summarized, it was a question by related to Glenda about the need to increase capabilities and opportunities for participation in science to enhance capacity of science to respond to social needs. But the question Valeria puts there is about who participates when most of the SDG related science is conducted in small parts of the world. And I think this can be connected, Glenda, perhaps in your experience, to a second question which was raised, given your country and the place in which you work, about how this may be more difficult in countries which are intensive in natural resources.
Thank you. And please, we can all feel free to come back. It's not just questions for the panelists, it's a discussion. There's a lot of very experienced people in this group, so we also welcome reflections back. Falk, I think you wanted to intervene.
Well, I have one question, and I start with one of these catch-all phrases, at least for me as a non-native speaker. That is, what's the theory of change? And let's say my one application of this nice term is, so what drives change, and there are different sources of this change, and knowledge can be one of these sources, but there are also other sources like power and money and all the stuff we know. And my question, or I would like to learn a bit more, is about Susan's talk on the institutions we need, but also the conceptual work of the project presented by Tommaso and Joanna. A while ago, I also published a paper with colleagues on global water governance. That's the area where I have a little knowledge, and it was called the missing links in global water governance. And the basic idea behind is, if we want to achieve an impact in the end, various positive drivers have to be into play. And if one is missing, if there is a missing link, we will not see this kind of outcome. So I wonder, how much are you down these roads to say, even if knowledge or scientific insights, innovation, whatever, as a necessary condition is in place, but if, let's say, the governance, the political institutions, mindset, worldviews, what have you, is not yet there, we cannot achieve it. And maybe also for you as an initiative, I could imagine to have what I love to call a poster child, where things come nicely into place and to say, here we see the impact. Or if we have another poster child that can so directly present that many things have been in place, but there's still a missing link, and yet we do not see the initiative. So my question is, does it resonate with your thinking? Is it oversimplistic? And what could it tell you to well, basically nail down the question, what's the role of science, technology, and innovation in achieving the SDGs?
Thank you. A challenge for everyone, I think, but Susan, especially hinging on your talk.
Well, let me pick up and try to get us all engaged in this discussion of new institutions and what they might be. There's undoubtedly a whole lot of different ones, and experimentation with them is really important. But since in that part of the world that's producing a lot of the scientific knowledge, at least as it gets published, those are largely countries that have a lot of their research and development effort being carried out in private industry. And private industry is oriented to markets in various ways and money bottom lines. So we actually had to invent a new kind of corporate legal structure in the US called a B corporation, a benefit corporation, to allow the corporation to pay attention to public impact rather than just making money. And because it's that context that orients a lot of the research that we're talking about. And I will just throw out the tough proposition that we actually have to get to transformation in private firms as part of the set of institutions that we need for this next for the next transformation. And I do want to give some credit where credit's due on the whole challenge of institutional invention, because I really picked that up from Chris Freeman's work on technological change and inequalities. The last round of change actually kind of invented the welfare state, but I think we can be pretty clear that just patching up the welfare state is not what's going to work in our current circumstances. So I'm going to throw out what can we get private industry how can we transform it? What role can we get it to take in the world that we actually want to live in?
Yeah, yeah. Maybe another colleague wants to pick that up, but something I would say, Falk, in relation to your question and what Susan just said, is that on theory of change, what assumptions are being made or should be made about how actually to affect this rather ambitious kind of impact that all of us involved in this kind of activity are trying to pursue. And one of the difficulties that is assuming that things are what they seem on the can, accepting at face value, not least for reasons Susan just said, that companies operate under situations where they're bound to represent what they do in certain ways, even if their actual motivating incentives are different from that. So how do we penetrate that? And an idea I just want to throw out in case it's relevant is from John Elster, the civilizing effect of hypocrisy. That it's not necessary for one's interventions to be, you actually think people are taking things at face value. In this case, that people actually want to align with the SDGs, but one can create a discourse which actually starts to exercise pressure, which at the moment is sadly lacking. So it doesn't solve a problem, but it means we don't have to take all the statements that are made in this space at face value in order to try to build up a little bit of pressure on the line Susan was just saying. Any other responses or questions emerging?
Glenda.
I've got a point.
Please do, Glenda.
I think the point that Joe made about the catalytic role is quite vital. What we have found when we're doing research that is not very popular or won't catch the public imagination or the funders' imagination very easily, that when you appeal to the SDGs and clothe what you're trying to do in relation to the SDGs, it is heard more easily because there is such widespread global acceptance at the level of government of the need to pursue the SDGs. So this opportunity of clothing whatever one's trying to do in more radical ways in relation to the SDGs, I think, and the catalytic role. And that really comes to answer my answer to Valeria's question, is using that catalytical role to try and push other agendas. Because I would argue that orienting our research to more towards needs is a first step, but to put it into use and uptake and benefit requires quite fundamental changes in how we do science. Yeah. And that is a very idealistic agenda, as Elisa put it, but it's certainly one that I believe in and keep pushing.
Absolutely. Through my work. Thank you. Absolutely, I share that. And yeah, it does raise the point that the metrics then, both the metrics in the SDGs and those that Falk is talking about, group efforts like ours developing, they have, as Pedro said at the beginning, a direct instrumental function, but they can also have that catalytic role. They can also serve as heuristics. It does not matter. The fact that people endlessly raise uncertainties and variabilities about any given metric doesn't mean it can't operate in this catalytic way that I think you raised there. Tommaso, you were going to raise a point, I think, from the questions.
Yeah, no, I was two quick points. The first one is about the difficulties that we have, and I think Glenda is also pointing to that in understanding what is the impact of this research. Of course, we can have, and this is a point that Joe was also making, we can have a lot of research on health and SDG 3. What is the impact of that research on people's lives is a different thing, and it's something that we know only well, at some point down the line, and it's obviously not direct, as we know. It's not just because you do a little bit more research on one particular aspect of science, of research that is related to an SDG, that you will have a better outcome. And I would like to link to that and make a reflection by what Glenda just said in terms of the catalytic use of SDGs, which can also have a dark side in the sense that lots of research is currently being flagged as SDG, because it sells better and because it increases now the ranking of universities and researchers now that we have new rankings based on SDGs. So I think we have to be a little bit careful there in, yes, it's a good catalytic way force, but it can also have some dangers. But on this point about the impact, I don't know if Valeria, Rashid, or Nimisha, or Bhuvana Huansia are also here in the webinar, and they've been working for more than 1 year on the case studies in understanding science technology innovation pathways and in understanding how different ways of doing science and innovating in different contexts may have different impact on SDGs. So I'm wondering if, without, sorry, Rashid, Valeria, and Nisha to call you, to put you in the spotlight, but I think it would be great to have your point of views given all the work you've been doing there.
Yeah.
Thank you, Valeria. Okay. Please.
Yes, yeah, thank you, Tommaso. Yes, and actually I agree with Glenda's point. In our case study, we are doing research on research for Chagas disease, and particularly trying to understand to what extent open science practices could make a difference in terms of alignment to the different SDGs. And one of the dimensions of open science in our definition is actually participation from the communities and the different stakeholders, not only community, but also policymakers in the area of health and sanitation. And we did, it's very clear the capacity, the enhanced capacity to respond to different needs when there is an increase in participation. My question was to Glenda, was also, it was related to the fact that in our case study is very contextualized, so it's research carried out in Argentina. So the communities and the policy makers had the opportunity to, in some cases, in some projects, they had the opportunity to participate in the research. But if we acknowledge that most of the research is not on Chagas, even on Chagas or on Chagas related issues, is not carried out in Argentina, but somewhere else, then how could we guarantee that the potential participants are the relevant ones in terms of the social needs? I understand that there are different ways of participation, and it's not, now more than ever, we know that we don't necessarily need in-person participation, but for some communities living in some particular context, that could still need, to have like a face-to-face interaction to have a relevant participation and an effective participation.
Thank you, Valeria. Thank you very much.
Maybe I can.
Oh yes, please, Rashid, please.
I think I will maybe try to start from where Valeria ended. Even in cases like we looked into a case study in rice in India, especially in terms of trying to understand how rice farmers are supported by science, technology, innovation to adapt better to the changing climate. So we looked into the two pathways. One is the breeding pathway, where formal science is involved in terms of breeding new varieties. And the second pathway is about the in situ conservation efforts by communities, traditional farmers, the tribal farmers, which they have been doing it over a long period of time. Even when research is conducted within the country, unlike the case of Chagas, there is very little participation by the tribal farmers. The farmers are not partnering, are not a participant in any of the discussions. And the problem which we are seeing is that it is a part of the question of governance. Because within governance, there is no mechanism for these communities or producer organizations or civil society supporting these farmers to participate in the discussion. So actually there is no participation. And in that process, what has happened is that there is no discussion about the sustainability, the environmental sustainability, nor there is an interest in talking about equity, the gender, or inequality. So the science basically is on a race to develop new varieties. They are basically trying to break the yield barrier without no questions asked on the equity dimensions or the environmental sustainability. And even when the research is happening within the country, the governance is I think it makes it impossible for the the real participants to participate in the decision making. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent. Well, I don't see any further questions, and we have the final input to our crucial input to our discussions today coming up. So before I introduce that, and colleagues can correct me if they have seen anything I miss in the meantime, I just wanted to also correct an imbalance I introduced in only mentioning one of our key sponsors, funders in this, which is the UNDP, for whom we're producing this project report. Also, the UK Research and Innovation Organisation, who in partnership with the UNDP are absolutely crucial to the mix and provided the original source of the funds for our work. So I should acknowledge that and thank colleagues from UKRI who may indeed be here as well, which is part of my thinking. So now we turn to the last stage of our session. Thank you everybody for some really rich discussion points. It's going to be enormously valuable for the project. And that last stage is to turn to someone with enormous experience inside mainstream innovation systems, Professor Sir Jeff Morgan, from University College in London, to give us some reflections on these thorny challenges of governance. How do we undertake the governance of these kinds of activities? So Jeff, over to you, please.
Well, thanks very much, Andy. I will try and share a screen just to show a few pictures because it's late in the day, at least for some of us, and to try and keep people focused. And I'm going to talk about really the global governance issues which come up from many of the comments made through this session, and to try and share some thoughts on possible options for future global governance around the strings. So I'm just going to start with one little quote just to warm us up. Jeff Hammerbacher, former head of data at Facebook, who said, "The best minds of my generation are thinking about how to make people click ads. That sucks." And in a way, I suspect our motivation, all of us, for this whole exercise is a sense of a massive imbalance in terms of where the world devotes its brain power and where actually we need that brain power as well as money and institutional resources and political will to be devoted. And there is a massive imbalance. As we've heard, STI is inclusive neither in its ends or the means. And I think that the Strings team have done a fantastic job at mapping the reality, the alignments, misalignments, etc. To me, it's still striking that the world's top STI funder still spends more than half, I think, of all public R&D on the military. And in a way, there's a long history in STI of very opaque decision-making, either within nations or companies. And we've sort of taken for granted that compared to other fields like healthcare or medicine, this is much less democratized or open or transparent. And there are obvious historic reasons for that in terms of military security reasons and so on. But I think we shouldn't accept that reality. Now, the strings analysis obviously is feeding into options for national strategies on aligning STI and SDGs and alternative pathways. But I'm going to address a slightly different question, which is really about what might be possible at a global level. What is the logic? What are the missing institutional pieces revealed by this exercise? And I'm going to suggest I'll do a minute or so on 4 sort of sets of interlocking options, which I hope we might get feedback on and consider. The first is observatories, and we've seen in the last few decades, in some ways, the extraordinary impact of IPCC and of the world attempting to observe its own climate phenomena, involving thousands of scientists and models and analyses, etc. And although on its own this doesn't lead to change, IPCC is one of the reasons why at last, there was a Paris Agreement, there is the changing behavior of investors and so on. And however inadequate it is, actually seeing things in a structured, formal way through a global observatory can have a big impact. So the first suggestion is, why not create a global science and tech observatory? In some ways, normalizing, institutionalizing the kind of analysis Strings has been doing, creating authoritative living maps of all the categories of spending and of their purposes to obviously guide priority setting, whether by national governments or foundations or donors. And it may be that will be helped by some synthetic indices, you know, the HDI, GDP. We've got a whole series of indices which have been created in the past, and they're always fraught with controversy. But actually some simplification sometimes can be quite useful for turning insight into action. I don't know what that index could be, but I think there's a glaring gap for a more structured, systematic global observatory on ends and means in relation to STI. I mean, secondly, if such data and analysis exists, then it becomes easier to organize what we could call constellations. That is to say, gatherings, not necessarily in a formal governance sense, but of the main players, the main funders, to pool their data, to share their analyses, to coordinate mutually, and to use that to prioritize. And so, for example, that's one of the charts on hunger. Maybe we do need a more structured constellation around malnutrition. There's a number of players on early childhood, under fives around the world, again, gathering research and policy knowledge and so on. And in the last 10 years, funders in several fields have started using principles of open data. So all of their funding is automatically open for APIs, so that, as it were, a system becomes self-aware in real time. And this is one of the fields I work in relation to collective intelligence. How do you turn systems into something more like a nervous system with conscious formal representation of actions, interpretations, and so on? That doesn't seem to me so implausible. Thirdly, maybe more pooled global budgets, taking a step further from constellations. There is a history of this, CGIAR in farming, very controversial in some cases in relation to the Green Revolution, GM crops, etc. Topic Andy's done a lot of work on in the past. And of course, COVAX, more recently, 20 years ago, I worked on advanced market commitments. So it's in some ways remarkable to see how normalized that has now become, a number of players do literally pool their money in order to achieve a goal. But there are other fields where there's almost none of this kind of pooling. And you can imagine that pooling both on particular goals. Maybe Melinda Gates in her new status will invest more in gender equity, perhaps leading some kind of pooled budgets, but also on emergent areas of STI around new tools such as AI, or the many Internet of Things, Fourth Industrial Revolution technologies on which there's been surprisingly little concerted alignment of investment and global goals. I just wrote a piece on that this week, was the absence of civil society in that whole process of vast commercial and government investment, which not surprisingly has been skewed in many ways very much against citizen democratic public interests. And then finally, this is the week of G7 in the UK in sunny Cornwall, and we have in a few months COP26. One of the lessons of global governance is there are the formal structures with power, but actually a hell of a lot of the reality of global governance comes through gatherings, even online ones, but mainly face-to-face ones, where people come together and talk about big issues. And it's easy to disparage these as talking shops, the COPs. If any of you have been to a COP, they are a kind of nightmare, not least in terms of air travel and carbon footprints. But they are the way the world comes to a shared understanding of issues and solutions. And maybe that's what we need alongside the others, is a more systematic, maybe annual, biannual gatherings where the key players come together to talk about R&D priorities, to discuss the data, to spot the gaps, to make it normal to think about the misalignments of actions and priorities, just as IPCC has done in relation to climate, constantly and through the COP process, bringing people back to focus on the gap between what needs to be done and what actually is being done. Now, in some ways, these should all be, these are statements of the obvious, but of course, these don't happen. They don't exist. They're not on the ministerial agendas in the way that COP and G7 and so on are. So that's some of the thoughts about what might be implied by the strings analysis, though of course it doesn't specifically come out of the strings analysis. These are the absences which are in a way made visible by the act of doing a project of this kind. So I was going to offer two very final thoughts. One is really about the UN. I think we have seen, and this is several previous speakers commented on this, there is a glaring governance institutional gap in this space. A world which spends ever more on R&D and STI in all its forms doesn't have institutions which quite reflect that. And the thought experiment is just to imagine if a United Nations was being created in 2021 rather than in the late 1940s. To me, it's inconceivable it would have a monetary fund, a bank, all these institutions based around money, but none around data, none around knowledge, none in the way we're talking about here, quite around science. Obviously, there is, UNESCO and little bits of other agencies, but there's nothing with the kind of strategic, data-driven clout, which we now take for granted in finance, happens with IMF, World Bank, and so on. So that's the thought experiment. And the second gets back to the little discussion earlier on theories of change. Now, of course, none of these institutions can solve the problems of realpolitik and commercial power and conflict over emerging fields of technology. But just as in science, again and again, actually new ways of science, of seeing things have preceded new scientific theories, everything from biology to X-rays to astronomy. This happens again and again. You start with a new way of seeing and then you generate new theories. Something like that also happens in global governance, that if you start with systematic observation of new facts, then over time, sometimes new ways of doing succeed. So I think incumbent on the Strings project, and I hope everyone on this call, is to see how we can accelerate that process. How can we build on the sort of fantastic work that's been done on the research side, mapping these realities? How does that become not just a one-off project, but part of the global governance infrastructure, so that in time, we can not repeat what Jeff Hammerbacher complained about and see all the best minds around the world devoted to either damaging or trivial tasks rather than the ones which really matter. Thank you.
Wonderful, Jeff. Thank you very much. Really nice, clear, positive suggestions there. Observatories, constellations, pooled budgets, gatherings. I'm sure that will catalyze a bunch of comments. We only, unfortunately, have 5 minutes for further points to be raised, but I think let's hear from Susan and Falk, I see, and anyone else to reflect on what Jeff has just been telling us. Susan.
Oh, just wonderful. I'm really taken by, let's imagine that we were starting the UN now and building data sharing and allocating and pooling rules in somehow. I think that's a beautiful vision. Is anybody working on it, including you, or is that what we should do in part as one of the spin-offs of the Strings project?
Jeff, I think that's a question straight back at you.
I mean, I've done some work in the past, particularly in relation to data and global knowledge, but I hope the Strings project can be a push for this. And in a way, it's a sort of approach which was much less plausible 6 months ago under a previous, under the Trump presidency. But I think to some extent with the new administration in Washington becomes significantly more plausible. So that's why I think we are in a time when we need to be a little bit more ambitious in our imagination. It's very easy to see all the constraints. Most people within the UN systems can give you 10 reasons why none of this could happen ever. But of course, you could have said exactly the same 3 years before the UN was created.
Yeah.
Well, it doesn't have to happen in the UN, right? Because this is a new thing that we're inventing, and often you have to do the new things. And I did put a little reference to the recent technological innovation report, because the work that's actually gone on the global shape of the underlying technologies for the fourth industrial revolution really calls attention again to the data ownership. It's being seen entirely as a national resource to be cashed in on, with no notion of, oh, there's a part of this that actually needs to be devoted to our goals together. So I love the idea. Let's do something on it.
Thank you. Thank you. Falk.
Well, I would like to pick up on three things. One you said last, one you didn't say, but one you said. That has to do with the pooled budgets. Some half a year ago, so do we see a new, let's say, appetite for more multilateral action? That's one dimension, question mark. Hopefully, yes. Second one is the new, and this is not little stuff anymore, it's really getting traction and into the mainstream, sustainable finance as a driver, I would say, in the past years, not just the past 6 months. And the third one is, let's say, the whole connotation and implications of climate neutrality 2050 or when. And from this, I have to question, I think, do you see opportunities that we pool indeed resources and budgets coming from a globally connected world, with somewhat more multilateral approaches, but also, let's say, having this balance, net balance, and the kind of CDM philosophy that we bring, let's say, some of the resources to where the needs are the greatest. And CGIAR is in this context a rather medium to small example of what is needed to fulfill the various dimensions of the 2030 agenda. I have a feeling we will not be done by 2030 yet. But how would you bring it together in the positive sense of the positive part of offsetting, so to speak, the climate neutrality, the sustainable finance, and hopefully a new appetite for multilateral approaches?
Thank you, Phil. I see Elisa also. Jeff, I'll come back to you to pick up some of these points, but very quickly, please, colleagues, because we're actually running out of time. These are great points, so Elisa.
Okay, very quickly. First, let me say how exciting this idea is, because this global governance of knowledge fits very well the idealistic agenda I was suggesting, but I think there is something that already resonates with that, and that's science diplomacy. We have made progress in science diplomacy, and it can help to connect with this wonderful idea.
Yeah, thank you. Sadly, I think we're going to have to draw to a close, but Jeff, please pick up on any of those points you would like to, and we'll have other opportunities in the future, no doubt. But Jeff, please.
Yeah, these are great questions, and I'd hope you would also perhaps follow up with suggestions. And since we are at past, there's no real time to go into them. And in a way, I've suggested a series of layers of perhaps different degrees of plausibility and political capital. So I think an observatory requires less than pooling of budgets, less probably than grand summits with presidents and ministers. So maybe we start there. There's obviously anxiety about the power of any new multilateral pooling entities. Obviously, our IMF and World Bank are not one nation, one vote, or let alone one person, one vote. They reflect donor power, and that might well also be true of future constellations, pool budgets, and of course, is part of the controversy of previous, even small ones like CGIAR. So there's a lot of detail to be done on these, and it may well be constellations focused on specific topics like carbon reduction may be one avenue to push this because there are other there's other momentum around science diplomacy rather than going for a comprehensive universal macro solution. But in a way, my purpose was really just to start this discussion, not to end it.
That will be the fate, I think, of many of us. Well, thank you so much to everybody, to all our initial speakers, to the panelists, to Jeff for that wonderful rounding up. And I just one quick nugget of thought myself. I'm not sure if it's a nugget or a lump actually, but that you mentioned, Jeff, the importance of civil society as well. And my thinking is part of the trick here in making the most of the kinds of interventions you've just nicely outlined is to take a social movement point of view. The SDGs are there because of social movements. Science started as a social movement. Arguably no progressive change ever occurred for women, for enslaved people, for colonies without social movements. This is a very ambitious progressive agenda, and thinking about the things we've just been talking about in relation to, through the lens also of social movements and how we can engage with and catalyze and respond to those is also part of the challenge, I think, as well. So thank you, everybody. We will look for other opportunities. Please keep tabs on what the Strings project is up to. We hugely welcome any feedback, including critical feedback on what we've outlined today. And I, with that, would like to thank people again and leave us at the end of our meeting. Thank you very much.